All right, hi everybody. We are moving on to the next chapter, but I wanted to remind you real quick. Quiz 1 that covered chapters 1 through 3 closed at 11:59 p.m. on Sunday. So if for some reason you haven't emailed me about that and you did not get that quiz done, please email me if you need to or haven't looked at it yet. You should look at the syllabus for my policies regarding makeup quizzes. You can make up the quizzes, but the policies are a little different depending on whether you have an excused or unexcused absence. So please read through that and just send me an email if you're having problems with that or really with anything else. So I'd also like to remind you just to make sure you include which class you're in. I'm teaching 3 classes this quarter, so just it helps me a lot to let me know which class you're talking about when you send me a question. Okay, so we're going to talk about chapter 4, which is basically kind of a crash course in ecology. So some of this information will be a review from things you might know from high school or from taking intro bio, and a few things might be things you're not familiar with. So what is ecology? It's basically the study of organisms and how they interact with their environment. And it most often includes studies at the population level. So if you'll recall, that's all the individuals of the same species living in the same area. There's also community ecology studies, which is a lot of what I do. So that's all the populations of different species in the same area. And a lot of times when scientists study this, they might just look at a subset of the community. So you might see studies that are about like the bird community. So they've studied all the different species of birds, but obviously there are other things like mammals and insects and plants that would be in the broader community for the whole area. And then finally, ecology studies can also be at the ecosystem level. So that would also include the abiotic factors. So this tends to include things like nutrient cycling and looking at biomass of different types of organisms in a certain area. So a key question in ecology is, why do some species live in some places and not in others? And we see that there are limitations on where an organism can live. Most species have a set of factors that determine where you find them and where you don't find them. And those different things can include abiotic factors like the amount of moisture, temperature, pH, light, nutrients. It could include prey, so you have to have food to live in an area. It could include shelter, so things like bats that roost in caves. They're really limited in where they can live because they have to have a cave nearby. And similarly, breeding or nesting sites. So like some birds need particular types of trees, particular types of areas in order to nest. And so that's going to be really important to where they live. There's also all the biotic factors in an area that can also be really important as to whether a species can live somewhere or not. So one is competition with other species. If there's another species that's a lot better at getting resources than you are, you might not be able to make it because the other one gets access to all the resources that you need. Predation, there may be some predators that you just can't deal with. You can't hide from them effectively, and they eat too many of that species, and so it can't live in the same area with a particular type of predator. There may be some parasites that are in the same category. You have to be able to deal with the parasites you're going to come across with in the place where you live, and same thing with other pathogens. So a key idea here, and what I was just talking about, is limiting resources. So there are lots of different things that might determine where species live, but the one that is the most important or the most likely to be scarce is going to be the limiting resource. So it's the one that limits the population growth And usually it's like a specific food. It could be temperature is really, really important, and that the species can only live in a narrow range of temperatures. Water availability might be really important. The bat example is right here. A lot of bat species are limited by their roosting habitat. So as I said, if there aren't the right kinds of caves around for bats to roost in or to overwinter in or both, then they're just not going to live in that area. So that would be their limiting resource. A critical factor is the single factor in shortest supply relative to demand that limits the species distribution. And so this particular lizard needs a very particular kind of desert, and you can see that's why it's limited to this kind of strange configuration of habitat. So kind of similar to those ideas are tolerance limits. Each environmental factor, there's a minimum and a maximum level beyond which a particular species cannot survive or reproduce. So this could be, temperature is a really good one. You know, like there are some temperatures that are just too cold for some species and some temperatures that are just too high for some species. So there might be some optimum where they're doing great and they're reproducing a lot, they're growing and surviving really well in this range of temperatures. And if you get a little bit too hot, then they might still occur, but they're not going to be as many of them. They're not going to reproduce as well or survive as well. And the same thing on the other end. Whereas there might be some areas that are just a little too cold. They can kind of make it. You might still find some of them there, but they're not doing as well. And then there are these limits of tolerance where if you get lower than that temperature, there aren't going to be any. You're not going to find them. And if you get higher than this temperature, you're not going to find them there either. So, and this could be lots of things. It could be, you know, water pH. It could be amounts of nutrients. It could be soil moisture. It could be the abundance of your prey. Lots of different things might be important, and they have, all of these things have tolerance limits where you can find a population in the optimal range for something, and they'll be less frequent on either end, and then there'll be some area where they won't live at all. So range limits, this is basically where in space do we find different species. So for most species, it's the interaction of several of these different abiotic and biotic factors rather than just one thing. So that can be important to think about. It's not always just, you know, one thing that you can narrow it down to. Ecology is complicated, is what I like to say. There is a famous quote that says, ecology is not rocket science, it's much harder. And it's because there are all these different things that could go on and interact with each other to affect what's going on, and it makes it hard to understand. And I'm not going to expect you to understand all the complexities, but what I do want you to know is that, you know, sometimes it's not just one thing that limits where species live. It's sometimes many different things. And another thing to think about is that tolerance limits are not necessarily the same for every individual in a population. So like the young might be more sensitive to extreme temperatures than adults are, or to lots of other factors as well. We also see that species requirements and tolerance can be really useful indicators of specific environmental characteristics. So here's an example. If any of you are fishermen, trout have really narrow requirements. They like really cool, clean, well-oxygenated water. So if they're not surviving in a particular stream where they used to be or where they should be, then it might be a problem with the water quality. Sometimes when the water quality is bad, the oxygen goes down, and that can be a problem, or maybe it's just not clean enough. I will point out that trout are sometimes put in places where they don't belong. So if you know that trout have been there before, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the habitat's not right. Sometimes people put them in places at certain times of year just so people can fish them. So that's not the same as having a population that lives there naturally year after year. Another important concept here is that species that are really sensitive are sometimes called bioindicators or indicator species. And these are species that we look for to see if the ecosystem is healthy and is functioning the way it's supposed to. So like the trout, I study aquatic insects, and a lot of them are also not very tolerant of clean or of unclean and water that doesn't have a lot of oxygen in it. So if a stream becomes impaired and has a lot of pollution or something is disturbing the stream, there are some aquatic insects that you just won't find there. And there are so many species of aquatic insects, you can look at the whole community and use them as bioindicators to tell how well that stream is doing.